Hello, my name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today I'm going to talk about the formation and evolution of our political parties in America. I'll be focusing particularly on the 19th century and, of course, their divergent ideologies and doctrines. Now, of course, when we started, our nation following the Revolutionary War, we started with no political parties, especially with the philosophy of our founding president, George Washington, who hated the spirit of partisanship. George Washington, of course, cautioned the nation against the spirit of partisanship, that the formation of political parties, of course, would lead to foreign influence and corruption in our government, that it would divide the nation, it would cause a spirit of retribution and revenge, and of course it would distract from the public good and from people focusing on the business of the government. Of course, George Washington would be elected as president unanimously. He's the only president who was elected unanimously. Of course, at that time, we didn't have the mechanism of the popular vote. At that time, it was the Electoral College which elected him unanimously. And so in the beginning, political parties focused more on in the beginning, without a political parties, the nation electoral process focused on the personality and not on party programs. However, ironically, George Washington's selection of his cabinet would lay the seed for the formation of political parties due to the presence of two of the most divisive and contentious cabinet members, and also amongst the most brilliant cabinet members we've ever had in any administration. Of course, that's the brilliant Secretary of the Treasury, the young Alexander Hamilton, and who went on to form the Federalist Party, and his nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State and who was the leader of the Anti-Federalist. The Anti-Federalist also became known as the Anti-Administration Party. They were also known as the Democratic Republicans. Now, so going back a little bit, remember in the beginning, we didn't have we had the Continental Congress, and eventually we realized the weaknesses of the Continental Congress, and so there was a move to actually have a constitution and stronger federal government. And so Alexander Hamilton would write the Federalist Parties. He wrote most of it, over 60% of the Federalist Party, of the Federalist Papers, the Federalist Papers were written by Alexander Hamilton. And so that was the beginning of the Federalist Party. So it was initially the ratification party. So the objective at that time was to have the states ratify the Constitution, right? So the ratification, from the program of ratification, the Federalist Party came to be identified with things such as a strong central government, advocating a very strong national government, federal government, central government. These terms became synonymous. They advocated for an economy based on banking, trade, commerce. And so Alexander Hamilton was advocating for a national bank. He wanted a national bank. And of course, he advocated on internal improvement. He wanted a strong standing army. And of course, regarding foreign policy, Alexander Hamilton had affinity for the British. He was an Anglophile, and so he wanted us to be closer to the British. Of course, generally he chose neutrality, but in the event of maybe emulating a government, he wanted us to copy the British government. So of course, his nemesis, his opponents in the Anti-Federalist Party, which came to be known as also the Democratic Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson, who were also the Anti-Administration Party. That's the Democratic Republican Party. They were also known as the anti-administration party, because eventually Thomas Jefferson, because he didn't succeed in his disputes with Alexander Hamilton, who was favored more by President George Washington. So Thomas Jefferson prematurely left the administration. So he was advocating, him and James Madison, they were advocating against the administration of, George Washington, which Alexander Hamilton was the anointed de facto most powerful man. Of course, apart from George Washington himself, Alexander Hamilton was the anointed most powerful man in the administration of George Washington. So the Anti-Federalists or Democratic Republicans, of course, they wanted a loose government. They wanted states' rights. So you see the origins of the advocacy for the states' rights. States' rights, of course, to also protect their institutions, including slavery, right? And they were against tariffs. Now, the Federalists, I didn't mention, they were for tariffs. They wanted tariffs to be able to protect the nascent industries, which were particularly in the North. But in the South, and where the Democratic Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison was stronger. They were both Virginians. Their economy was based on the slave economy, on slavery, and so they were an agrarian economy. They were against tariffs because they realized that tariffs would precipitate retaliatory tariffs from Europe and Britain, which bought their cotton, right, their agricultural products, and besides they bought luxury finished goods from Britain, from Europe, including iron, so they didn't want the retaliatory tariffs. So the Democratic Republican Party were against tariffs. Additionally, of course, they were against internal improvements. They thought internal improvements should be within the purview of the states. That's a local matter. Especially, they didn't think that, that the internal improvements had anything to do with them. By the way, I've done a video discussing internal improvements. Internal improvements was of course, that had to do with the development of transportation, roads, harbors, turnpikes, things that facilitated transportation and trade. So these were the main features of these two opposing parties, and of course the Democratic Republican parties, like their leader, who was a Francophile, they wanted better relations, a foreign policy that leaned towards France. Now, so this era between 1790s and 1820s, about 1824, we had the faction, the two parties that were contending were the Federalists and the Democratic Republican Party. However, something happened in 1812 after the leader of the Federalist Party, Alexander Hamilton, was killed prematurely in the duel. In 1812, there was the war against the British, which is often called our Second War of Independence, because the Federalists had favored the British. They were seen as being disloyal, and so there was this fervor of nationalism in the nation at the time, and so it basically led to the decimation, if not, it led to the decimation, if not total disintegration of the Federalist Party. And so this came the era of good feelings, because we had a de facto one-party system. That was the Democratic Republican Party, because they didn't have any strong rivals at the time. So the president at the time, around 1820, was James Monroe, our fifth president. He was almost unanimously elected as president as well, but except for one elector just ceremonially opposed him, so that I guess it was sort of symbolic to make sure that Washington, our first president, remained the only person who was unanimously elected. But in any event, the Democratic Republican Party was virtually unopposed during the era of good feelings, because their Federalist rivals had basically petered out. They were no longer they were non-existent at the time, and then came the era of Andrew Jackson, right? Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian Democrats, they so the Democratic Republican Party started to splinter. It started to splinter because of the personality of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a Democratic Republican. In fact, by the time of John Quincy Adams, by the time the Federalist Party had been decimated, all the presidential candidates came from one party, the Democratic Republican Party. And so eventually when Andrew Jackson became president, there was splintering within the party system within the Democratic Republican Party, and so it was basically like everybody who was against Andrew Jackson because of his authoritarianism. He was a very authoritarian president. People started to break up and coalesce against him. So there was a Whig party, because the Whigs, they took their name after a party in England that was against the monarchy, because at this time Andrew Jackson had started to sort of really centralize power. He was a very robust president, and so people started to disparage him, that he was like a king. They used to call him King Andrew, and so they formed the Whig Party. Basically everybody was coalescing against Andrew Jackson at the time, and one of the people that joined the Whig Party, of course, was John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams had been the president just before Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson had, of course, he caused another faction, a party in South Carolina, to come up. They were called the Nullifier Parties, led by John Calhoun. John Calhoun had actually been the first vice president of Andrew Jackson. So something happened in 1828. John Quincy Adams, the president before Andrew Jackson, had passed high tariffs, which was called the Tariff of Abominations, and so in South Carolina, there was a Nullifier Party led by John Calhoun, who was the vice president of Andrew Jackson, and they were contending that if a state felt that the federal government had passed a law that was unconstitutional, they could nullify it, they could invalidate it, and so they formed the Nullifier Party. They were threatening to secede. But however, Andrew Jackson, who was a very strong-willed president, he threatened to hang them, and he threatened to use federal troops to enforce federal laws, including the tariffs of abominations, and so and using the force bill. Now, so that was the Nullifier Party. Secession did not occur. So many parties, as I said, coalesced, formed against Andrew Jackson. Now, those who supported Andrew Jackson, especially led by the remarkable organization of President Martin Van Buren. He was vice president. He was the second vice president to Andrew Jackson at the time. He was a remarkable organizer, and so he formed the Jacksonian Democratic Party, the Jacksonian Democrats. So they were the Democratic Party, but they were known as Jacksonian Democrats because they supported Andrew Jackson, who was a populist. Andrew Jackson was trying to expand the votes to white men in general, not just limited to propertied white men. So he was a populist, and so they had the Jacksonian Democrats at the time. And of course, another party that formed against Andrew Jackson at the time was the National Republicans and the Anti-Masonic Party. The Anti-Masonic Party was against Andrew Jackson, who was a Freemason, right? So they were against the Freemasons. They were against anything that Andrew Jackson was, because they thought Andrew Jackson was appearing to be a tyrant, a monarch, too powerful, and so everybody was just coalescing against Andrew Jackson. And of course, there was a Whig Party, which didn't really have a party program, but they were mainly against Andrew Jackson. The Whig Party, it brought about, 4 presidents. William Henry Harrison, who was our shortest president, he died, and of course there was also his successor, who was John Tyler. John Tyler was he was from the South. He was a Virginian. He was also a slave owner, but he lost the confidence of his party, the Whig Party, and so. Because he didn't follow their programs, and so they kicked him out of the party. So he was a president without a party, and of course he formed his Tyler Party, which was short-lived. And he wasn't able to gain the presidency. So after the era of Andrew Jackson, the Democratic Party became really powerful. The Democratic Party that we know today has its provenance from the Democratic Party that was formed, around the Jacksonian Democrats. Now, so later on, after the era of Andrew Jackson, slavery became very contentious, and so other parties started to form regarding slavery. Now, the Compromise of 1820 meant that the nation was basically divided into half with slave-owning states, and half that was the North were free states. So, for instance, if we had 11 free states in the North, right, then we had to have 11 free states in the South. We had to have 11 slave-owning states in the South. Why was this important? Because it affected representation in Congress and the Electoral College, and so they kept this tenuous balance. However, as we started to expand westward, right, we were getting new territories westward. There was now the issue of southern states wanted to have. They wanted to have those states to become slave owning, and so there was something called the Compromise of 1850, where they came up with popular sovereignty, saying that, well, let the states be able to divide, let the new states decide themselves. Actually, that came much later with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, but the Compromise of 1850 strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, Fugitive Slave Law. It came up with the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically it criminalized anybody who was helping an escaped slave. And so this was something that the North found very offensive. And of course, later on with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which now allowed popular sovereignty, and it was saying that, well, let the new territories decide if they wanted slavery or not. The North felt betrayed. They felt cheated with this new act, and so it eventually led to the Civil War. So there were now parties that were coming up. There was a party called the Free Soiler Party, and saying that, well, let their Free Soiler Party, let their they were an anti-slavery party. They all had other programs as well, but importantly, Martin Van Buren, who had formed the Democratic Party, was now in the Free Soiler Party. Free Soiler Party was not strong enough, and so they eventually formed with the they formed with the Republican Party. Now, the Whig Party, which had William Henry Harrison, Martin Van Buren, Zachary Taylor, and then Millard Fillmore. Those 4 presidents, eventually it died off, and many of their leaders went on to form the Republican Party, which was anti-slavery. The Republican Party did not want the expansion of slavery westward, and so eventually the Civil War came about. Now, after the Civil War, there was now a new issue. The Republican Party was now the dominant party. They were the ones who won the Civil War, and so there was a contention regarding the spoil system. The spoil system was actually created during the time of Andrew Jackson. He created the spoil system and the patronage system, and now the Republican Party wanted the spoil system to remain, and so those were the stalwarts in the party of the Republican Party. They wanted the spoil system to remain. There were also the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans had wanted immediate abolition of slavery, and they wanted immediate equal rights of the freed slaves. However, again, the stalwarts wanted the spoil system to remain because, you know, they'd won the war, and as the saying goes, to the victor go the spoils. However, there was a faction within the Republican Party known as the half-breeds. They were against the corrupt spoil system, and of course the Democratic Party that had created the spoil system, now that they had lost access to the executive patronage and the spoil system, they were now agitating against the spoil system. And so you had this factionalism going on, and this was a situation during the Reconstruction era. Now the radicals in the Republican Party were able to successfully pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I've talked about the 13th Amendment, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment made African Americans United States citizens. It gave equal protection of the law. It gave due process of the law, and it applied all the Bill of Rights to the states, right? It wasn't just a federal matter. It applied all the Bill of Rights to the states. And so that was the 14th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment gave the votes to black men. So this was the situation, by the end of the 19th century. Now, after the Civil War, after the Reconstruction era, the main parties were now the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, right? The Republican Party was now advocating for the gold standard. So monetary policy was now a huge issue. They're advocating for the gold standard, while the Democratic Party wanted a more expansionary. They wanted a bimetallism, right? They wanted bimetallism. That was now one of the contentious issues at the time. By the time of the 19th century, the party system had basically crystallized into the Republican and the Democratic party that we know today. Of course, as we know today, the ideologies would eventually shift. Right, the Democratic Party was now their goal was to foster engender white supremacy. Right, they were against civil rights for the newly freed black people. They were against the spoil system because the Republican Party used the spoil system to also give patronage jobs, federal jobs to the newly freed black slaves and to black people in the South. And so the Democratic Party, which had created the patronage and spoil system under Andrew Jackson, they were now against this. So while the Republican Party, they were for civil rights initially, and now they were also for higher tariffs. They were advocating for higher tariffs. They were advocating for the gold standard. Let me stop here. I'm going to continue the discussion, moving to the 20th century. By the way, it's drizzling right now. My name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and at the same time I draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts, which I'm experiencing in Montgomery County, Maryland. I was swatted on May 16, 2023 in my home. I wasn't committing any crime. I'm a law-abiding American citizen. As of that day, I was a federal government employee, an auditor in the Department of the Navy, and I was swatted, and my rights have been violated. I've been framed by Montgomery County Police. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.